In the heart of a quaint, unremarkable town lived a man named Edward. Edward led a life as mundane as the town itself, working a 9 to 5 job, living alone in a modest apartment on the third floor of an aging building. His life was a routine, uneventful and predictable, until one peculiar evening that shattered the monotony forever. It began innocuously enough, with Edward returning home from work as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets. As he ascended the stairs to his apartment, a fleeting movement caught his eye. He paused, glancing behind him, but saw only his shadow stretching out on the wall, distorted by the stairwell's flickering light. Shrugging off an uneasy feeling, he continued home. Over the following days, Edward began to notice oddities with his shadow. It started with small discrepancies, a delay in mimicking his movements, or subtle gestures he did not recall making. Initially, he dismissed these observations as tricks of the light or figments of his imagination. However, as days turned into weeks, the anomalies grew more pronounced, more disturbing. His shadow seemed to acquire a will of its own, moving independently, albeit subtly at first. It would stand still when he walked, or sit when he stood. Edward found himself spending hours observing his shadow, trying to understand the impossible. The more he watched, the more he became convinced that this was no mere trick of the light. His shadow was alive, sentient, and it was watching him. Sleep became elusive. Edward lay in bed each night, eyes fixed on the wall where his shadow danced in the moonlight, performing actions he never commanded. Whispered conversations filled his apartment, voices emanating from the corners of his room, always just out of comprehension. Paranoia took root in his mind, the constant feeling of being observed, even in the absence of light. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Edward began researching shadows, delving into ancient myths and obscure scientific theories. He stumbled upon tales of shadow beings, entities that exist in a realm parallel to our own, capable of influencing or even consuming their human counterparts. These stories spoke of a ritual, a way to sever the connection between man and shadow, but at a grave cost. One night, driven to the brink of madness, Edward decided to perform the ritual. He followed the instructions meticulously, drawing ancient symbols on the floor, lighting candles at specific points around his shadow. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. As he recited the final incantation, the candles flickered violently, casting erratic shadows around the room. Then, silence. Edward looked down, expecting to see his shadow severed from his feet. Instead, he found it missing entirely. A cold dread settled in his heart as he realized the ritual had not severed the connection. It had freed his shadow from the physical realm. Now, no longer confined to mimicry, it could roam freely, unbound and invisible. In the days that followed, Edward's life became a nightmare. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and he caught glimpses of a dark figure in the corner of his vision, always just out of sight. His shadow was no longer a mere reflection. It had become a malevolent force, tormenting him for its own inscrutable purposes. Edward vanished without a trace several weeks later. His apartment was found in disarray, symbols scrawled on the walls in desperation or madness. The only clue to his fate was a single word, etched into the floorboards where his shadow once lay: free. And so, in a quiet town where nothing ever happened, the legend of Edward and his shadow became a chilling tale of caution, whispered in hushed tones. A tale of a man who discovered that some shadows, once noticed, refused to be ignored. Subscribe to the channel, and also on our Telegram and Facebook there are a lot of interesting stories.